As I stepped out of the lift earlier this morning, there was Matthew, one of my staff, standing there, and he asked me the question, "How are you?" I thought he'd long since learnt that that was not a question to ask me, because I usually go into a long palaver about how I am. So I paused, nevertheless, and I thought, well, will I tell him that there's a bit of a blur across my left eye, that I've very slightly injured my left knee, that yesterday I had a bit of a headache? No, I thought that's no good. What does he want to know? So he looked at me. Did he look at me? And he said, "Are you in a good mood or a bad mood?" Oh, it's my mood you're thinking of. That takes a bit of thinking too, to decide what sort of a mood am I in. I was in a good mood just a moment ago, and now it's different. No, he said, in yourself, how do you feel? Well, then I thought, what does he mean by in myself? What are you talking about? What part of myself? He could have said, though he wouldn't dare say such a thing, I'm sure, he could have said, "You're such a pain in the neck." And then I would have turned my head right round, and I said, as a matter of fact, I do have. Well, people through the generations have been talking about the self. You must stand up for yourself. That's what we told our children. People through the generations have told their children, look after yourself. Standing up for yourself requires specific skills and sensitivities. Or looking after yourself can be so short-sighted. If everyone lived by that statement, look after yourself, then we wouldn't look after anybody else. Both pieces of advice or exhortation need to be accompanied by yet another exhortation, perhaps expressed through the years by Ella Fitzgerald or Louis Armstrong. Just direct your feet on the sunny side of the street. Right on the height of an Australian summer, you should see those words as metaphor rather than taking them too literally. For being alive, it means being alive if you're on the sunny side of the street, being alive to self-affirmation, self-enhancement, self-magnanimity, all of that. So today, of all days, this question: what kind of self will you take into the new year? In a very significant essay, at least for me, Philip Cushman wrote that since the end of World War II, Western society has allowed itself to be drawn more and more towards the empty self. And if empty, we settle to live in that state of emptiness, or we go all out to fill the empty space, the empty self. And we fill it up with anything and everything, from more and more food to more and more possessions, more and more people around us. Perhaps to temporarily at least lessen that anxiety of emptiness about which I spoke a couple of weeks ago. A restless interiority keeps making us wonder what sort of self can be possible, given, say, what has been happening in our life, what has been happening in the past, given the intensity of the various comparisons we make, the comparison of feeling less than we might be, or feeling less than other people, or the comparisons of being different from somebody else, the comparison of what is with what might have been. All these comparisons take place. The comparison of what we dreamed would be the ideal self with what is the all too real self. So you're aware of that entity that you call the self. But you know it has many parts. The scripture was alluding to that idea today, that the self has many coats in its wardrobe. Take out a few of them. There is the empty self, there's the hungry, driven self, there is the anxious self, there is the confidently controlled and controlling self, There is the depressed self and the happy self. There's the cautious, curtailed self, and there is the magnanimous self. There is the resentful self and the liberated self. There is the worn-out self and the resilient self. And so we could go on. The bereaved and grieving self and the restored self, the soothing self. All of these, this is the self. We talk about self-esteem and self-righteousness. We know how much we deceive ourselves at times. We attack ourselves. We sabotage. We undermine the self. We even laugh at ourselves. What is this self? The real self, the ideal self, the authentic, the inauthentic self, the self in conflict, the guilt-ridden self. All of these are part of the self. Some of us settle for just one of those. I'll settle, if you like, so some people will say, I'll settle to be the aggressive self today. Not a good self, but there they are with that self today. Most of us, however, would take a mixture of all of them, a little bit of everything. Daniel Siegel, in his book Mindsight, to which I've alluded several times before, he spoke of finding the core self. It's a strong word in my language. The core self. I talk with people frequently about the core trauma that they've been through, or the core anxiety. You can have one trauma exploding onto many traumas. You can have one anxiety and you start to unpack them. You find that you don't have just one anxiety, but 20, 30 of them. But what is the core anxiety? Because we can't really deal with all of them. What's the core? Beyond or underneath our layers of attempted adaptation and coping, beyond our state of mind at the moment, there is this core self, is there, that looks for ways of getting the many expressions of the self and the anxieties of the self to find some integration. So the question I'm asking first of all today is how do you bring your core self to operate in such a way that it brings things into focus, that you have a balanced view of your life, to give a more harmonious sense of the best self possible? That's a question I'm putting before you. I'm going to ask several other questions. And the next one I'm going to ask is this: what will be critical in bringing the core self into focus, into harmony? How can we focus the core self in the coming weeks? There may have been times in the past when you have felt very vulnerable. So you need strengtheners at those historically vulnerable places so that they do not continue to create anxiety or do not do damage in the present. So that's the first thing you need to look at, is to see how we can strengthen yourself at those points where you've been vulnerable in the past. Where there are identifiable damaged places, you need relevant patching up. You need relevant healing in those damaged places, lest they go on doing damage. And that's what the self frequently finds, that the damage keeps perpetuating damage, albeit different damage from what occurred in the first instance, but damage nevertheless. Or you may need to listen to the call of resilience. You're going to hear that word again and again in 2013 because it's one of the major themes for this year. Realizing that resilience can occur spontaneously, fortunately. Resilience can occur through a process of waiting. If you wait long enough, perhaps that resilience, that comeback will occur. Resilience can be planned, or often we must seek it. It has to be sought. And above all, we need to practice it. It needs to be specifically practiced in several places. I often encourage people to climb up, as it were, metaphorically speaking, onto a higher place, above the inner aggravations within yourself, above the interpersonal antagonisms that inevitably occur, and above the cultural emptiness that can so often invade our self, climb up a little higher so that you can speak from a higher place, above the intimidations of fear, onto this higher place that you can have your core self up there and have its processes and powers of self-affirmation being strong, self-worth being strong, self-healing being strong. If you're up there with those particular self-expressions, then you're going to cope with the aggravations and antagonisms differently down here. The higher view, the core self needs to speak from a higher position. You'll see that the self-strength, the core self, will begin to function differently at different points across the age spectrum, across the wisdom spectrum. The core self will function differently. It will function differently in different situations. So rather than being stuck with one unitary idea of what the self is, recognize that the self will behave differently in that situation. It will behave differently with different anxieties and emotions are in play. It will behave differently, function differently, according to the resources that you can gather around you or that gather around you anyway. What cultural influences can be activated? It will function differently if the core self can be persuaded, continuously persuaded, to be part of its own protection and its own growth. If it can be persuaded to choose the energy of vitality over that compulsive, repetitive nightmare of fearful vulnerability. So again and again I need to say it will function differently if it can be persuaded to climb up onto this higher place, where it has a better perspective, where it can hold a more permanent purpose of self-control, self-protection, and self-enhancement. So that's the second question. How do we give the core self its focus, the focus of healing, of better functioning? So what kind of self, given its fragmented, the ordinary everyday fragmentation of the self, what kind of self, how do we get an integrated core self? And how do we give that core self focus? But the third question, we need to find ways to keep the self, the good self, the core self, in positive growth, on a positive growth trajectory forwards. Jesus kept pointing forwards. And so where was he pointing to? He was pointing to the energy of that faith which would carry us forward. Now you've seen it, how some people can be carried back into a childhood self. Even in their old age, they can we say they have regressed to the child self. And it can take place in such a way that it takes over everything. We can identify the growth activity of the self in childhood, the growth that can take place in adulthood, in middle years, old age, and very old age. Some of the self becomes active in good times and in bad times. So that in times of success and failure, you can call on that higher self to come to the rescue. In times of ill health and times of well-being, both ways. We can sometimes think that as soon as our health drops, our self must go out the door as well. But in fact, the self can be called in to rescue us, the good self. When there's a relationship failure or relationship difficulty, the self can still be there to make sure that you're seeing things from that higher, better perspective. So the self. Someone says something and we say, what you said was very hurtful. Hurtful to what? What got hurt? Can we identify the hurt? What do we do about it? Do we know how to heal the hurting self? Or better, more accurately, do we know how to heal the hurting part of the self? Does the healing depend upon the kind of hurt that you've experienced? Or does it depend on the resources that you can pour into the situation, or both? Does it depend on your capacity to soothe the hurt and move on? And so on. All these questions are very important to us. But above all, can we identify the hurt, the areas where the hurt occurred, so that you might deal with it much more specifically and positively? If you call on your religion, your faith, to heal your hurt self, would that work? Does the new faith about which we speak, can that be called upon to help you deal with your hurt? If the new faith means anything at all, it keeps pointing to that healing of the self, that active healing process of the self, where you can be healed and proceed to a different kind of living, to a better life. It is surely notable, isn't it, that specialists around the world have developed lifetime study and research to the healing of the damaged heart, to the healing of the pains that develop in the stomach, or even to the healing of the mind, the grieving mind. Many specializations have now developed. But despite the known fact that the hurt self can go on hurting for months or even for years, the hurt self can even go on a rampage of hurting, damaging and ending relationships, damaging and destroying a whole generation of families and many others. In spite of all that, we do not heal in the deep levels of the self. In fact, we often don't know how to heal it, where the distressing memories are there, defying all efforts to defuse the distress. There are large populations of counsellors and therapists and clergy and soothers, a whole lot of them. But in large part, their knowledge of restoring the damaged parts of the self is often as vague as is their capacity to identify which parts of the self have been hurt. So if you don't know where the self is hurting, see, with the body generally, we can easily say, my eye, my knee, my stomach. But no, he was talking about how do you feel in yourself? How do you feel in yourself? How are you functioning in yourself? So the damage persists. The self that is hurt may manifest itself in anger, in humiliation, in guilt, in jealousy, in social embarrassment, in displaced revenge. All of those. Each one of these manifestations will require a different healing. How do we repair the damaged parts of the self? And how do we reconnect with the oxygen, the great oxygen cylinders of resilience? It is not a new problem. It was written way back in biblical times, and it is well known in every hospital ward across the country. In one of my books, The Traumas of Life and Their Treatment, I inserted in the preface pages words of Ernest Hemingway when he said, "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are strong at the broken places." Beautiful words. Many are strong at the broken places. But we need to add the sheer reality. Many remain broken and bereaved or bowed by one or many of those burdens that we carry. Perhaps we of all churches in this country and beyond are in a position to hold a meeting together, a symposium in 2013, on the different ways to heal the self when it has been damaged, or when it remains damaged or defective or depleted long after it should have been healed. The Beatles used to sing that song, didn't they? All you need is love. And the film now showing has jockeyed the words around a little bit to read, love is all you need. But when it comes to repairing and restoring your hurting and damaged self, we know we need more than love. Oh yes, we'll have the love, but we need more than love, much, much more. But we're not sure what more is needed and what more would be effective. So I come to the fourth question. The three questions: what kind of core self? What kind of core self will you bring to your life this year? How will you give it focus? Focus so that it will find the focus of healing, that position, that higher position, and functioning. How can we develop specific skills for the specific damaged parts? And the fourth question: where then will we place faith in this experience and expression of the self? Each Sunday we come here and we talk about a magnanimous self, to be open to a different kind of self, to find a joyful self, to see that there's part of the human being which can open up in praise and thanksgiving and joy. But then quite quickly we close down. It's like some of the flowers in your garden. They open on the sunny side of the street, but at night time the darkness comes and they close over. We're a bit like that. The new faith about which we speak focuses on an integration of the core self. It is the therapy of an elevated perspective. Paul Tillich, the theologian, spoke of the God beyond all of our gods, the God beyond God. Here we speak of the self beyond all the fragmented selves. In that self above the many fragments of self, we find a strengthening of the self, a good self, wanting to discover the ongoing goodness of the good me. Faith in the recovered and resilient me, the good me, the sound me, the whole me. It joins with the psychological elevation of the self. From the strengthened me and the elevated self, we begin to leave our negative and destructive ways and put ourselves in constant search of the source of all goodness to continually enrich the self, to continually energize the self, and to keep us in touch with what is the very best self. Yes. Would you please stand? So I invite you to be open to this next phase of our gathering together today, to the sacrament. The sacrament reminds us that we can be in touch with something deeper in ourselves, communion with the deeper self, a communion with the higher self, a communion with that good spirit within, between, and beyond us, and thereby be enriched and carry that enrichment and that good spirit from here to there.